That's what I'm looking at. Okay.
Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the final lecture of the 2024 Public Lecture Series. I'm Alicia McCowan, Event Coordinator, and I'm delighted to welcome you to the Geological Society. A few housekeeping bits before we start. For those in the room joining us today, fire exits can be found here and here. I feel a bit like a flight attendant saying that. And there are no planned fire alarm drills, so if you hear the alarm, please treat it as a real one and make your way to the nearest fire exit. The muster point can be found outside the Royal Astronomical Society in the courtyard. And if you have any questions or queries, just look for someone with a yellow lanyard. There will be a Q&A section at the end of tonight's talks. For those in person, please raise your hand if you have a question, and we will relay the question so that those joining us online can also know what the question is. For those online, please submit your questions using the Q&A function of Zoom, and these will be read out. Without further ado, I would like to introduce you all to Dr. Scott Davidson from the University of Plymouth, who will be talking to us today about the role of peatlands as a natural climate solution.
Hi, folks. Thank you very much for coming out tonight to hear me speak about one of my favourite subjects. You'll soon be bored of me by the end of this, hearing how awesome peatlands are. But yeah, as Alicia said, today I'm going to speak about the role of peatlands as a natural climate solution. Just very quickly about me for some background. I lead the Wetland Resilience Research Group at the University of Plymouth, and my research themes are focused around three main topics: the role and extent of peatlands in the global carbon cycle, how disturbances, that I'll touch on later in the talk, will impact that carbon cycling, and finally, how do we use community science to understand peatland resilience and make people care about them. Because you'll soon hear from me that for many, many, many years, peatlands have been maligned compared to other types of ecosystems. And under that banner of my research, I really work on this concept of peatlands being a natural climate solution. But what is a natural climate solution? Very simply, it can be kind of thought of as a nature-driven approach to reduce greenhouse gas emissions and enhance the resilience of natural ecosystems to help fight against climate change and help mitigate against it. So simply, how can nature help us in that fight against climate change? They really are some of the best superheroes in that fight, and peatlands being probably, in my opinion, the most important one. So when you give lectures like this, you kind of never really know how to pitch it. So I'm going to start off quite basic and then we'll get up into the juicy stuff later. But for some of you, you might not know what a peatland actually is. Some people might have an idea in their head, but maybe I'm going to blow your minds in terms of how exciting peatlands can be. They are a type of wetland, and they're waterlogged ecosystems where partially decayed plant matter accumulates as peat over thousands of years. And so they're definitely a type of wetland, and many people think of them as kind of the ones you get up on Dartmoor, kind of misaligned ecosystems that people think of as scary or places that you want to go and die. But I'm going to change people's opinions on that tonight. There are a variety of different peatland types across the world, but they fall into three main categories here. We've got fens. These are ecosystems where they are connected to the groundwater, which means they're a bit more nutrient rich. We've got bogs. These are ombrotrophic ecosystems. That means that they get all of their rainwater, their precipitation, their water from precipitation. And so they're a bit more nutrient poor. And then my favorite, the ones that get the least attention, really the Cinderella of the wetland world, is swamps. These are forested peatlands. They can have quite deep organic matter in peatlands, but we don't know very much about them. And a lot of my research is focused on just trying to understand these ecosystems. And where are they? Well, you can see across a lot of the Northern Hemisphere, there's vast amounts of peatlands, especially here in Canada, where I do a lot of my research. We have a fair amount in the UK. They're not in good condition, as a spoiler for the rest of the talk. Huge amounts across Canada, but you'll see there's patches in other countries as well. Lots in Indonesia and in Asia, and here down in the Democratic Republic of the Congo. And so the next few slides are just kind of highlight the variety of different peatlands we have across the world. These are some sites that I work in Canada. This beautiful mosaic of different habitats. I think, again, some people might not realize that peatlands can have trees on them. So this is like the peatland up in Wood Buffalo National Park in northern Alberta. Other side of the continent, we can see in South America, down in Chile, the Tierra del Fuego in southern Patagonia. Again, this beautiful peatland coming down in this valley here, storing large amounts of carbon. We've also got huge amounts of peatlands across Indonesia. These are incredibly important peat swamp forests. In fact, the orangutan typically only lives in these peat swamps in these areas. Again, the Democratic Republic of the Congo. But a little bit closer to home, and you might have seen in the news recently, it was recently awarded UNESCO World Heritage status, the Flow country up in the very north of Scotland in Caithness. And one of my favorites coming up, and some people might not realize this, but Australia has some very nice peatlands in the mountains. I spent past January there, looking at these quite rare ecosystems up there in the mountains in the Alpine National Parks. And I'm going back, thankfully, in next January as well. So it's a very nice place to spend a winter for us, but a summer for them. Now, peatlands, many people think of them as not very diverse ecosystems. And I can't lie to you, they're not as diverse as some other ecosystems in the world. We compare them to rainforests, they have nowhere near the same amount of diversity, but they're incredibly important for the diversity that we have. You can see here that many of our peatlands have these beautiful carnivorous plants called sundews. So because these ecosystems are nutrient poor, they need to get their nutrients from elsewhere. So they have these plants that eat insects. But also we use them a lot for subsistence as well. So many indigenous communities around the world will use peatlands as a way to kind of gather and harvest food, not just berries, but also caribou, moose, that type of thing. They're also incredibly important for water, not just the quality of water, but also the storage of water. We kind of sometimes think of peatlands as a sponge holding back water. That's why the issue in the UK is that we've degraded our peatlands so much that the water just runs off the moors into lower lying areas, but they're incredibly good at holding that water back. But they're also a very good filtration system. But my bread and butter, the reason why they're a natural climate solution, in my opinion, is how important they are for carbon. And we can see from this image here, this beautiful peat core, all that organic matter that had taken thousands of years to develop. And so peatlands store approximately 550 billion tons of carbon in their soil. This is more than all other vegetation types in the world combined. So huge amounts of carbon being stored in the soils. This is around 21% of the total global soil carbon stock. So they really, really are important. And we've kind of worked, many people have worked for decades trying to quantify how much carbon is stored in these systems. And yet they're still not seen as just as important as some of the other ecosystems in the world. And so why do peatlands store so much carbon relative to other ecosystems? Well, I'm going to take some of you back to maybe high school biology in its simplest form. But the carbon in an ecosystem is the balance between what comes in through photosynthesis and locked up in the plants and what's lost. We think of that as GPP, gross primary productivity, how productive the vegetation is. And what's lost is CO2 to the atmosphere, ecosystem respiration. But the clue is in the type of peatland it is. It's a wetland. These ecosystems are wet. And so those anaerobic, anoxic environments that lack oxygen means that decomposition is slowed down. And so what's coming in is not outweighed by what's being lost. And so over thousands of years, we have an accumulation of peat compared to what's being lost. We might also have carbon being lost from the system laterally through dissolved organic carbon. As I said, the water storage capacity of peatlands is important. We do lose carbon that way as well. But they're also important sources of methane. Those wet conditions that allow for carbon to be stored for over millennia are also perfect for methane emissions to be produced. Methane likes to be produced in those anoxic, oxygen lacking areas in the soil column. And so peatlands can be a source of methane to the atmosphere. And wetlands as a whole are one of the largest sources of methane to the atmosphere. However, like I said, over millennia, over thousands of years, the input of carbon into these systems means that when they're healthy, they're accumulating peat, they're accumulating carbon, and it's not being outweighed by what's being lost to the atmosphere. And how do we measure that? And so I include this slide here because I think sometimes I speak about carbon measurements, but some people in the audience might not realize what it takes to understand carbon from these ecosystems. So we can measure peat cores, like here, where we get an actual carbon stock from the ground. We can do this here. This is a student of mine from a few years ago in Canada, measuring carbon fluxes coming out of the ecosystems. So we place a chamber on the ground here that creates a seal on the landscape, and we're able to measure how much carbon is coming into the system and how much carbon is coming out of the system. And that helps us to quantify a flux from the ecosystem. To measure those aquatic fluxes, that dissolved organic carbon moving laterally through the system, we would take water samples, and we often describe this as being tea. You can see here different range. This is a very peaty water on the left-hand side there. But another way, in order for us to quantify carbon emissions from these ecosystems, are these things called eddy covariance towers. Whereas closed chambers are really, really useful from a spatial point of view, I can send myself, when I was a PhD student, and now I send my own PhD students into the field to collect carbon measurements across a wide variety of ecosystems. We're limited by the temporal aspect. I'm not that much of a taskmaster that I require my students to be in the field all day, every day, calculating, measuring carbon fluxes. And so machinery like this equipment here, can calculate that carbon over long time periods across the whole year. So it's measuring what carbon's coming in and what carbon's being lost across large areas. And all these different aspects together are used to help us model and understand those carbon dynamics across large scales. So very simply, a healthy peatland should be a sink of CO2. And by sink of CO2, I mean, like I said, it's holding on to more carbon than is being released. You might always get a source of methane, but overall, we want that healthy peatland to be a sink of CO2, a sink of carbon. It's holding on to that carbon. But alas, although we know, or I know how important peatlands are, and by the end of this talk, hopefully you all will as well, we haven't really kind of taken very much care for them over the last few years, decades really, or centuries. And a lot of them are in pretty poor shape. And why are they in poor shape? Well, for many years, they have been overused and underappreciated. Increasingly, they're drained, they're dammed, they're developed over. For many years, people think of peatlands as wastelands. They just think, oh, what can I do with it? There's no economic value of this. I will just drain it and build on it. And so we're losing peatlands across the world at a rate of 3 times faster than forests. Now, I'm not standing here saying that forests are not as important as peatlands. Everything is important. But when I show you there that there's 550 billion tons of carbon stored in those soils, and yet we're losing them 3 times faster than forests, that is a real issue. And so we need to do something about it. But they don't get the same level of attention. Things are changing. I think I'm a bit biased sometimes because I'm heavily fed through the media peatlands because of my Google Scholar emails that I get, but they don't get the same level of attention as other ecosystems. And why is that? And so I spent the whole semester being a lecturer, and so I am going to ask for some audience participation. I can see you all recoiling in fear. But does anyone recognize the films on the screen here? And so for those of you in the room, if you recognize it, please feel free to shout it out. And if you do remember the name of the peatland that's being represented in these images, does anyone remember any? Feel free, there's no wrong answers. There is technically, but yes, Lord of the Rings, definitely. This one here is Lord of the Rings. Do you remember the name of the wetland in it? Dead Marshes. Yeah, so Lord of the Rings is the Dead Marshes. This one traumatized a whole generation of people. Does anyone remember the film? This never-ending story. And this is the Swamp of Sadness. This one here, David Bowie. Labyrinth. It's the Bog of Eternal Stench. And this one here, up on the top left-hand side, is The Princess Bride, the Fire Swamp. And I really think that this kind of long-lasting impression that we have of wetlands as being scary, as being places where we might kind of go to die or get lost in, we kind of lose the ability to think of them as good things because we're scared of them. It's really permeated our consciousness when it comes to peatlands. Even the language we use about peatlands is negative. I'm bogged down with work. I'm swamped. I'm mired. I'm stuck in the mud. Bog standard. There's a lot of negativity around these words, and it really does influence how we've thought of them over many, many years. It might sound flippant, but I think there's a real truth in this matter. And because of that, we've lost wetlands at a drastic rate. This is a really nice study from last year showing this map where the warmest colors show the % loss of wetlands and peatlands across the world. And we can see the huge amounts of loss of peatlands across Europe, especially here in the UK, across the USA, and over here in India. We've lost huge amounts of these ecosystems. Again, this is just another way of showing this data, showing Ireland, unfortunately, is leading the way in the number of peatlands that is lost across the world. There's very few intact, healthy peatlands left in Ireland. We're not doing much better here in the UK. Up here, Canada and Russia might seem that they're doing okay, and I'll touch on Canada later. They're only getting away with it because they have so many peatlands to start with. But they're still causing a lot of disturbance on these ecosystems. But we can see here, these peatland regions, Northern Europe and Indonesia have lost large amounts. We've huge amounts of peatlands being lost globally. And again, just to highlight, to really hit home how much peatlands are being lost across the world. You can see this map on the left-hand side of peatlands in the UK. We've got the flow country up there in Scotland, where I'm currently based in Plymouth. We've got Dartmoor and all these dark patches across the Pennines and the Peak District, for example. And yet we have all these peatlands, but only 20% of them are not disturbed. That means 80% of the peatlands in the UK are emitting more CO2 to the atmosphere than they're storing. And there's huge amounts of amazing work being done to try and restore them, and I'll touch on that later. But this is really hard to see that a lot of our peatlands that should be these beautiful ecosystems that I've shown photos of before currently look like this, following decades of drainage, of agriculture, of just not taking care of these ecosystems. And so a lot of my research is trying, like I said in the beginning, is trying to understand how these ecosystems function. And so it's important that we're able to quantify undisturbed peatland extent and function. Where are peatlands? These maps that I've shown you are very, very hard to make. Peatlands are not easy to map. And it's also really important that if we know where they are, we want to know how much carbon they're storing. But what's becoming more and more prevalent, or increasingly important, is understanding how many peatlands are being lost. So we need to know where they are, and now we need to know how many we're losing and how many are being degraded and destroyed. And how does that affect a peatland's ability to store carbon? And so a lot of my research over the last few years has been focused on looking at disturbance impacts on ecosystems. One of those disturbances is fire. And I put in brackets there wildfire, because here in the UK, often our peatlands are impacted by not wildfire, but prescribed burning, but it's fire nonetheless. It's really odd being a fire scientist, because a fire might hit your site and you realize, oh no, and then you go, oh yay, so many cool questions to ask about how these ecosystems function. And so a lot of my work is up here in the boreal, looking at boreal peatland fires. Huge amounts of fires are happening in these ecosystems in the tropics, for example, in Indonesia. Whereas here in the boreal, these ecosystems are slightly adapted to fire, maybe not at the rate that's increasing under climate change, but they're slightly adapted. These tropical peatlands are not adapted to fire. And again, here, like I mentioned, in the UK, out of control grouse burns are having a big impact on our natural ecosystems. And so I wanted to show this map here of Canada, where I do a lot of my research. We can see here on the left-hand side, this map showing forest fires. And as you see nicely, what that aligns, if I was to overlay it on this map here, we can see the bluest colors show the highest proportion of peatlands across Canada, and they overlap really quite nicely. And so fire is proving to be a big risk at these peatlands. Now, a resilient peatland, a peatland that's healthy, its water table is high, should be fairly resistant or resilient to fire. A fire might move through, you might lose a little bit of the surface vegetation, but that ecosystem is healthy, and so we're not going to have a huge loss of carbon. It's low intensity, and the carbon recovers quickly. And I mean, the vegetation comes back fairly quickly. But what we're seeing more and more often is that because we've caused drainage, we've made these ecosystems degraded, they're disturbed, and then the ongoing impact of climatic changes, such as increasing temperatures, means that they're vulnerable to these fires. And when these fires get into the tree canopy, it burns incredibly readily, and then it gets a chance to burn into the peat. And that has huge consequences for how much carbon is stored in these ecosystems. I have a field site in northern Alberta that burned in 2016, and we lost 30 centimeters of peat. Now you can imagine it takes millimeters of peat to grow a year, so thousands of years to build up meters. 30 centimeters in one fire is a huge amount of carbon being lost to the atmosphere. And it's not just on a kind of physical environment point of view in terms of these fires, but human health as well. People live in these areas. These fires can burn for a very long time. Some of you might have heard of a term zombie fires. These fires can get into the peat and burn for over a year. Peat is a fuel. It's a really good burning source. It burns very readily when it gets the opportunity. And so it has big, big impacts. So myself and some colleagues led by Dr. Sophie Wilkinson did a study that was published last year where we tried to quantify how much carbon is lost from ecosystems where a wildfire might move through, and then the combination of if the ecosystem was degraded, how much more impact would that fire have? And the takeaway message here is that wildfire reduces that peatland carbon uptake across northern peatlands by 35%. So fires moving through peatlands reduces the ability of that peatland to take up as much carbon as an undisturbed site by 35%. If that peatland is already degraded before the fire moves through, increase that by 10%. And so climatic changes are impacting carbon losses, and increased burning will reduce the carbon sink over northern peatlands by over 50%. That's an incredible amount of carbon being lost, not just in terms of carbon being lost by combustion immediately through the fire, but the lack of recovery. These ecosystems are getting to the point where they can't come back. The fires are happening too regularly now, or the severity of that fire is something that they've never really seen before. And so another big impact on peatlands, it gets a bit depressing in the middle and then there's some positiveness at the end. So it's a roller coaster. But another big impact on peatlands is us, anthropogenic disturbances. We have had a huge amount of impact on peatlands over the last few decades and centuries. Some of you may have heard of peat extraction. This is where we drain peatlands to harvest peat for horticultural use. Here in the UK, we're trying to ban peat. That's not the same elsewhere in the world. And so some parts of the world, peatlands are still being drained and extracted for peat. In some places, it's done reasonably sustainably, like in Canada, where the footprint of that disturbance is quite small. But overall, this can have big negative connotations. As I said, a drained peatland, when it's dry, that oxygen gets into the soil, it switches it from being a sink to a source of carbon. Agriculture is a big impact on peatlands across the world. Here in the UK, many of our peatlands across the Fens and the Somerset levels have been drained and turned into agricultural land. There's a lot of work being done at the moment to see if we can balance the two. This is a term called polyculture. Can we use crops that can handle wet conditions to grow where we can keep carbon in the ground, but still use them because we're a growing population? But in other parts of the world, for example, in Indonesia, a lot of that slash and burn in these tropical forests is to create more agricultural land. So again, losing those peatlands. Another big impact, especially across northern regions, is resource extraction or mining. This is a mine that I work on in northern Alberta in the oil sands. This used to be a peatland, and so now it's been converted into a mine. And linked to that is this idea of habitat fragmentation. When you've got large-scale disturbances like this, you need things to connect them to each other. And so linear disturbances such as roads or these things called seismic lines that I'll touch on in a second, fragment that landscape. And so there's lots of combinations of different disturbances. And this one here is something I didn't really know about until I moved to Canada a few years ago to do my postdoctoral fellowship. And the scale, which I'll touch on in a second, of these disturbances is really quite staggering. And so I've got a map here of Alberta in Canada. You can see the warmest colors show where peatland cover is the highest. And again, if I get you to imagine overlaying it on the map on the right, you can see the highest cover of peatland area aligns really nicely where the oil sands is. And so we're getting a lot of impact in these ecosystems in terms of how much disturbance we're having here when we know that there's peatlands in these areas. And so I mentioned these seismic lines. This is a kind of type of disturbance that I've spent many years working on, trying to quantify the impact. When I first moved to Canada and I heard the word seismic, I got really excited because I thought it was earthquakes, but it's not earthquakes. These seismic lines are areas across forests and wetlands where they clear the trees, as you can see in this photograph here, to use radar to look for oil and gas deposits below the surface of the soil. The trees muddy the signal, and so they get rid of the trees to look for expanding those oil and gas regions and areas. And so a study by a colleague of mine, Professor Maria Strack at the University of Waterloo from a few years ago, created this map where the warmest colors are where peatlands and seismic lines overlap. And she was able to estimate that they've disturbed an area of 1,900 square kilometers across just peatlands in just Alberta alone. This is enough to go around the world 9 times. So there's enough of these lines, as you can see here across this photograph, cut across forests and wetlands to go around the world 9 times. So I think it's interesting, and I'm not putting blame here on anyone really, but I think it's really funny from a European point of view, as we think of the Canadian boreal as being this great wilderness, this untouched landscape, and actually it's heavily fragmented and the human footprint is really quite dominant. I have this video here that's hopefully going to work. Nope, it's not going to work. It's fine. It's a zoom in of a Google Earth where it shows that essentially vast parts of Canada look like an Excel spreadsheet. And you can see here all of these lines cut across forests. You've got bigger areas of industrial land here. These smaller squares are where they clear larger areas for equipment storage or creating new housing for the oil sands workers. And so vast amounts of disturbance in the landscape. And this might seem a huge amount of disturbance, and it is, but I'll touch on some ways in which these oil sands companies are trying to do better, try and lessen their impact on the landscape. But to start off with, it's a huge amount of disturbance. And what's really interesting from a scientific point of view, and this is really what wakes me up in the morning and I love what I do about my science, is the interaction between these kind of disturbances. And so this is a site of mine from a few years ago that burned last year. This is a seismic line, and this is the adjacent forest that burned in the 2023 fires in Canada. And so these types of disturbances are causing more natural disturbances, things like wildfire, and it's the interaction between the two. So we're losing huge amounts of carbon over here, but maybe that negative seismic line impact is actually, is that a positive? Are we storing more carbon there and that part is resilient to the fire? We don't know yet. But there's a lot of interactions between these two types of disturbances, which is really quite fascinating. And there's a lot of unknowns in terms of the impact of them. And so through these disturbances, peatlands are either degraded, as shown through this habit fragmentation, or removed completely. And landscape changes caused by human disturbances could release nearly 15 million metric tons of carbon. We're losing the ability for these ecosystems to store carbon as a natural climate solution. And so they reduce the ability to sequester carbon. And so we need to stop disturbing them because an unhealthy peatland turns into a source of CO2 to the atmosphere. You still might get that source of methane, which is a greenhouse gas that warms the atmosphere, but we're now switching it, the CO2 aspect, to a source. And so again, big impacts on how much carbon is being released to the atmosphere. But there is some positivity here, and there's some amazing work being done around the world in terms of restoring these ecosystems. And by restoring an ecosystem, I mean we want to reestablish the ecological processes and functions that returns that net carbon sequestration ability. How do we switch them from being a source back into being a sink of carbon again? And whether it's actually possible. Spoiler alert, it's incredibly complex. It is not an easy task, and large-scale restoration can be expensive and it's risky. You don't want to put thousands or even millions of pounds worth of effort into something if you know it's not going to succeed. We want to know that these things succeed. The people who fund these things want to know that they're going to succeed. And so it can be really difficult on how we frame these restoration practices. But how do we go from here, which is one of those extracted peatlands, to one that's returning to start to look like a natural ecosystem? And can we? Again, we can. We really can return these ecosystems back. As I mentioned before, many peatlands are disturbed by draining them. And in its simplest form, making them wet again and allowing those vegetation communities to come back will help us bring back that carbon sink potential. You can see here, this drainage ditch has been blocked. It's wet again, that water is seeping back into the peatland. It means that the connection for the vegetation is back there, the mosses can come back, and the ability for an ecosystem to store carbon again is back on track. And so I'll talk you through this graph here. It's a study by Kelly Nugent from a few years ago, where she looked at how much carbon do unrestored peatlands that were extracted and then abandoned, and we did nothing with them. How much carbon do restored peatlands store across the year, and compare this to ones that are intact and healthy and doing as they should. And so here we've got it 0. Anything above 0 is a source of carbon to the atmosphere. Anything below 0 is a carbon sink. And we can see here from this graph, you've got along the x-axis the months of the year. We've got the brown colors, which are the unrestored. So we've got 1 year unrestored, so 1 year abandoned. one that's 15 years post-abandonment, they're sources of carbon to the atmosphere. They're still dry and there's no vegetation there helping them store carbon. Restoration after 1 year, yes, it's still a source of carbon to the atmosphere. We need some time to get these ecosystems back on track. But what's fantastic is that the techniques developed across Canada, especially to restore these ecosystems, shows that after 15 years, we're able to bring back that carbon potential, that carbon sink potential. And so I'm making it sound very simple. There's lots of complicated science at play here and ecological processes. But within 15 years, we're able to switch a peatland back from being a source back to being a sink of carbon across an annual time frame. That's pretty incredible. Not only can we bring a peatland back, which is a little bit disturbed or a lot disturbed, and bring it back to a peatland, we can even build them from scratch. And so that mine that I mentioned in Canada, we were tasked, I was part of a project, I joined in 2017, so there's a lot of really hard work done before I joined. I'm not taking credit for that. But we were tasked with building a peatland from scratch on an oil sands mine. Can we try and bring back an ecosystem that will accumulate carbon? And if we give it enough time, and by enough time, I mean thousands of years, can we bring back peat accumulation? And so in 2013, we were gifted an area of the landscape. It was planted with wetland species, sedges, shrubs, mosses. We manipulated the water table to keep it wet. And you can see over the first 6 years how it turns into, I know it looks like a field, but I promise you when you're in it, it's very much a wetland or a peatland. But you can see that after the first 6 years, and this is a real cool study by a really good friend of mine, Natasha Popovic, for her PhD, where she looked at how quickly could that carbon sink potential return in a peatland that didn't exist the year before. And so again, using the same thing of carbon sources above zero, any positive values as a source, and below zero as a sink of carbon. And she was able to show that after 2 years, there's enough vegetation, that ecosystem is productive enough and healthy enough that within 2 years of building a peatland from scratch, we were able to store that carbon again. Again, that's pretty incredible in terms of how we can help these ecosystems come back. Not just restore them that are being degraded, we can actually build brand new ones. I won't lie to you though, it's a lot of hard work and it's very expensive, but it can be done. And so we need to avoid converting peatlands. The risk with restoration and reclamation, when I give talks like this, is that some people think, well, if you can do that, we can still disturb at the same rate we can, because we can show that we can restore. And that's not the case. We need to make sure that we stop that level of degradation across peatlands. Because how do we really quantify them as a natural climate solution if we just keep getting rid of them? And so how do peatlands function as a natural climate solution? I was part of a really cool study from a few years ago. It was during lockdown, so it gave me something to do when I was in my apartment, where I was tasked as the co-lead of the peatland team with myself and my colleague Maria Strack. We were able to try and quantify how are Canadian peatlands as a natural climate solution. So there's some incredible science here across a whole range of different pathways, forestry, agriculture, other types of wetlands, and us in the peatland team. And we synthesized carbon stocks and fluxes across a huge range of Canadian peatlands. We wanted to know where the peatlands were, we wanted to know the scale of that disturbance, and we wanted to know the carbon stocks and emissions from those areas. So we could help understand how much carbon could we save if we stop disturbing them. I'm going to use this phrase here, avoided peatland conversion. That basically means that we stop converting existing nice, healthy peatlands into something else. Peatland restoration, as I mentioned, returning peatlands back to a previous condition. And so Canada has 111 million hectares of peatlands. Canada is blessed with its peatlands, but as I've shown, there's a fair bit of disturbance, but there's a huge amount of beautiful peatlands like this one here in Quebec called Grand Pays Bleu. And actually, we were able to estimate that if we stopped disturbing all Canadian peatlands in their current format, we would be able to save nearly 10 megatons of CO2 equivalent per year by 2030. That's a huge amount of carbon being stored if we just stopped. Now, I'm not naive enough to think that the ability to just stop all disturbance of peatlands could happen, but we can show that there is a large amount of carbon to be saved there. Some of you might be wondering, well, wow, restoration doesn't seem to be doing very much in comparison, but that's because restoration takes time. A lot of the restoration work that we're working on are in the fairly beginning stages. I think some of the oldest peatlands in Canada that have been restored, the oldest restoration activities, are still under 30 years old. And so we need time to allow those good conditions to come back. But we're already seeing that if we just restore the ones that we have degraded, we have that ability to save a lot of carbon. And building on that Canadian study that we did, myself and Maria Strack and a couple of other authors, we were tasked with doing a global estimate. And so we were able to do the same thing, but for all different types of peatlands all across the world. It was quite a lot of work. And we were able to estimate that peatlands store a global natural climate solution of 1.1 to 2.6 gigatons of CO2 equivalent per year by 2030. Again, showcasing how much carbon they could be storing. I think that's equivalent to roughly 3 billion trees being planted. So incredibly important ecosystems. They are a natural climate solution, but we need to stop degrading them at the rate that we have been in the past. And I did this study with my colleague, Nick Gherkin, where after COP28, we tried to really highlight how important are peatlands and why aren't they getting spoken about? And so we looked through all 195 countries' nationally determined contributions. That's essentially the document that these countries put together to say how they're going to fight climate change. And only 43 out of them even just mentioned the word peatland or wetland. There was no mention of what they would do with those peatlands and wetlands. They just said, we recognize they're important. And so we need to try and get people to care about them more in order to really use them and that influence as a natural climate solution. And so I'm going to end there. I'm going to end here on how do we change people's perceptions on peatlands. And so I said in the very beginning that a big part of my work is using community science to try and help people's perceptions on the resilience of peatlands to change. And so I'm going to touch on a project that I created called the Tracking the Colour of Peatlands. As I said, that many people think of peatlands as wastelands, as places that people go missing. They're scary, literature and movies, as I've shown. They're areas that have been maligned over many years. But actually, I want to try and encourage people to recognize the beauty in peatlands. And so I created this community science project, or citizen science project, where members of the public can go to publicly accessible peatlands like this one here in the Flow Country in Scotland. There's 16 of these around the world, all the way from northern Alberta to Australia, where you can go for a walk on this peatland, you collect a photograph, and you send it to me, and I can analyze it for the colour. And it's that simple perception of peatlands and trying to understand how beautiful they can really help us understand and improve people's perception of them. The amount of emails that I get from people who say, wow, I didn't realize peatlands were so important. Or, wow, I went in March and it was brown, and I've come back in September and it's beautifully red. So they understand how they change over time. And it's that small recognition on how beautiful they are can be incredibly important. And so here, just an example, you've got up here some photographs from First Nard Flows up in Scotland, beautiful change in colour. And then you've got Miscou Island in New Brunswick in Canada. This one especially is really quite beautiful. It turns beautifully red in the autumn. Again, showing, I think many of you in the room might not realize how dynamic an ecosystem like a peatland might change over the course of the year. And it's capturing that with the public is really going to help us understand why they're not scary and they're places you might want to go for a walk. The amount of people that say, oh, I don't want to go for a walk on a peatland because I'm going to get wet. Well, A, these places have boardwalk, so you're fine. But B, there really are quite beautiful ecosystems. And so this project has been a success. It was piloted this year across 16 different sites. Here's a snapshot from 6. And on a scientific point of view, I can extract data from the photographs and look at how green they are over time. I'm not going to touch on that today. It's just to show that people are taking part in this. People are visiting peatlands. People want to be part of a project. And it's really, really exciting to hear people email me and say, I'm so excited to be part of a citizen science project. And so it's really part of my work is to try and help people improve that perception on why peatlands are important and they can be a natural climate solution. So to summarize, I think I've got a couple of minutes left for questions. Hopefully you all realize that peatlands are incredible ecosystems, and not only are they incredible ecosystems, but they're incredibly good carbon stores. But they're being degraded and destroyed at an unprecedented rate. Thankfully, we can successfully restore degraded peatlands, but that requires a lot of time and a lot of funding. And there is people out there doing incredible things, but we need to stop converting them at the same rate as we have been previously, because we want to recognize how important they are as a nature-based solution. Because really, hopefully, as I've evidenced here, they truly are our best player in the fight against climate change. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Scott, for that very interesting talk. You've certainly changed my views on peat. So does anyone in the room have any questions that they'd like to ask Scott? Yes.
I was wondering that if like development does have to keep happening, if a company came to you and said, we are going to go into a peatland and do some work, but how can we have the least impact so that when we do leave, it's the closest it can be to pristine? Like, what would you say to them?
I think keeping that footprint as small as possible. Sometimes there is going to be, we can't help the disturbance that happens, but making sure that it's not as bigger than it needs to be, and allowing, the footprint of that ecosystem, the footprint of the disturbance, is easier to restore if it's a smaller area. If you've got these vast areas, then it's almost impossible. And also, but a lot of these companies are on board. They really are on board. They're mandated to return them to near natural as possible. So they have to be on board, but they are on board. And we have some really fascinating conversations with how they want to improve how they do things. And it could be a simple case of not digging something the way they have done in the past. So it could be as simple as that.
Yes.
You said it's possible to quantify the amount of carbon that sinks and stored in these wetlands and peat bogs. Do you think it's possible to get, for example, carbon credits to help, for example, countries in sub-Saharan Africa, whether it's DRC, Malawi has some very important wetlands, for example. Do you think it's possible to get funding through carbon credits to finance the restoration and to keep these areas in pristine condition?
Yes.
Are there any projects like that?
Yeah, so the IUCN have the peatland carbon code. So landowners are, there is an incentive to keep, if you have wetlands or peatlands on your land, you can be, you kind of categorize them in what condition they are, and based on how good a condition is, you get a financial reward for that. So there's definitely ways in which we can monetize, because that's a lot of it at the moment is money. Like, how do we encourage people to care? It often comes down to finances. And yeah, there's the carbon code, similar to the woodland code. So if you've got woodland on your land, keep it in good nick, you get money for it. Same thing for peatlands.
So we'll just do one quickly from online. Why did peatlands in the northern Europe tend to lose more rapidly?
And so we lost peatlands in Europe because it's a smaller landmass. And so we are a large population across Europe. We probably just needed to get more agricultural land, more places for people to live. And so we lost them more readily.
And another one from online. What are some effective interventions at a national level which could reduce peatland conversion?
I think better education on the idea of what a peatland is. I think, again, historically, landowners, developers, they don't see them as useful historically, and so they just got rid of them. And so trying to improve that education is actually going to improve our knowledge on them, improve by people. We might think, okay, let's keep that there. I work on kind of we call them wet woodlands in the UK. These are shrubby, forested wetlands in the UK, and they're often the first to be cleared if you're a landowner, because a landowner goes over and says, what do I do with this willow scrub that's wet and boggy? They get rid of it. But actually, we show that not only is it storing carbon, but it's fantastic for biodiversity. And so it's just having that conversation of making sure we understand and recognize that importance.
Yes.
So are these ecosystems trying for climate change? In other words, reduce rainfall on a global scale?
On a global,
Offset that.
on a global scale, it happens in different regions. So Western Canada is getting drier. So those peatlands I work out in Alberta are going to be at risk from lower precipitation rates. In other parts of the world, it depends. But yes, I think the kind of ongoing climatic changes, increasing temperatures, these ecosystems have been resilient to change for millennia. The problem is that we've pushed them to that tipping point that they're not going to come back from because of that level of disturbance.
There's a question linked to the carbon credits point. I mean, for these markets to work well, obviously projects need to have high integrity. How is the sort of remote sensing, those sorts of techniques for actually monitoring these things independently and at scale coming along? I know you said it's difficult to monitor these places, but is that burgeoning?
That's why remote sensing is amazing for that level, because a lot of the funding for peatland restoration is very much just for the active restoration. There's no funding really for long-term monitoring afterwards. And there's no point in going into all that effort of restoring something if you can't monitor after. So you could go to the effort of bringing back those water tables in a peatland, making sure it's wet, and then you go into a 3-year drought period. And so that connection is gone. And so you need to make sure you're monitoring it. And that's where kind of remotely scaled remote sensing, or like kind of remote levels of monitoring, could be really helpful, because it's very expensive sending people into these areas. As I know with my students, it's hard to find funding to do these in large scale areas. And so we do need to utilize, but that photograph project, everyone has a smartphone in their pocket these days. And I've got a few study sites that are actually using the public to take photographs of their peatlands to monitor that condition over time. And so even getting peatland researchers to make sure they every time they go, take a photograph, and it helps you monitor over time, because it's amazing what you can glean from a photograph.
Great, thanks. So we'll go back to one that's from online. Why does carbon production fluctuate throughout the year from the peatlands?
Simply linked to the vegetation. So it needs a chance to get productive in this. So it gets greener in the spring, hits that maximum productivity in the summer, and then starts to peter off and senesce in the fall.
Thank you. And another question. One of the biggest development pressures for peatlands in Ireland are wind farms requiring drainage and the creations of roads throughout peatlands. Would you have any comments on this?
Yeah, it's a difficult question. Many parts of, even in Ireland and Scotland and other areas, we put wind farms on peatland because they're vast open areas that are perfect for that type of renewable energy. And it's a renewable energy, so people think of it as a win. Again, probably linked to the idea that the disturbance done is as limited as possible. So the footprint of those towers is as limited of the turbines to try and minimize any sort of impact on carbon loss. But getting those huge, and I'm sure some of you have seen them in person, like turbines are really incredibly massive. And so they're going to cause disturbance in the landscape. So it's how you utilize it, how you minimize that disturbance is really, really difficult. I do have colleagues working on projects across Scotland on this, trying to minimize that disturbance. But I don't have a true answer for you in terms of how to. It's just, it's a difficult one.
Any more from?
Yeah, when you go to restore peatland, do you consider use of genetically modified species or
No, native. Yeah, we try and encourage restoration using native species as possible. And so I didn't really touch on that here, but the way we restore those peatlands in Canada is called the moss layer transfer technique, where we gather sphagnum, chop it up, and spread it on the landscape. And as long as that water table connection's there, because you've blocked those drains, that sphagnum can establish reasonably quite quickly. And it's amazing how, even though peat takes a long time to grow, sphagnum can actually grow reasonably quickly. But yeah, and there's places here in the UK, there's a company called Moss, which is growing sphagnum in greenhouses to encourage restoration activities here in the UK.
Yeah.
I always thought trees didn't like waterlogged roots, but they just didn't grow. So I wanted to ask you, what sort of trees grow in your different sorts of peat?
See, it's one of my favorite questions, because sometimes trees love being wet. So those northern peatlands in Canada, the dominant tree species is black spruce. So black spruce is happy to grow on a dry upland area where it gets quite tall. On a peatland, it'll still grow, it'll just be much more stunted. In the UK, we have those forested peatlands that I mentioned, wet woodlands. They're dominated by willow and alder. So those tree species are really happy to have their roots wet. And then kind of across Northern Europe, a lot of the trees that are dominating those landscapes are Scots pine. They may be not as dense coverage as you might have in Canada across the boreal, but there's definite tree species that are happy. Trees on peatlands is a very contentious topic in the UK because people think of trees on peatlands as we're encouraging people to go and plant trees on blanket bogs across the UK. That's not what we're saying. But some peatlands in the UK and across Europe and across the world, trees are a really natural part of their ecology and they should be there.
Great. We'll have another one from online. Can peatlands play a role in acid mine and drainage, filtering water?
Yeah, yes, I don't know the ins and outs of that in terms of how it would work, but it's yes, peatlands can act as a filter for ecosystems, and a lot of here in the UK, historically peatlands would have been used as a filter for water. For downstream drinking water, and so normally peatland water should come off a peatland quite healthily, clear. But the problem is when you degrade it, you kind of you make that carbon much more labile, and then that's where the color becomes much darker. So we're losing peat from the ecosystem, and so the water filtering capacity is gone.
Another one from online. Is there a scale of how many peatlands are being aimed to be restored within a time frame?
Ooh, that's a big question. It's so hard. It really is hard because although I've got that map that I've shown that was created out of the Greifswald Center in Germany, showing that map of peatlands across the world, they're incredibly hard to map using that remote sensing. And so we don't really know how many there are yet. We don't really know how many are disturbed yet. And so it's really hard to say how many we need to restore. But we can show that the ones that we are restoring are actually proving to be really, really useful in that carbon storage potential. So if we can just encourage and keep that restoration going and showcasing to people that, look, all this time, this money, this effort is actually paying off. We are able to restore these ecosystems.
Great. So unfortunately, we're quickly running out of time. So we're going to have one more question from in person.
Essentially limits the rate of accumulation. Clearly, the amount of sunshine from the annual thing. But I mean, are there limitations in terms of other nutrients that need to be addressed in some cases?
In terms of nutrients, not so much. It's often constrained by the topography that they're growing in. They can't just kind of keep growing forever, and it's very much they're impacted by climatic changes. So they're kind of limited in terms of that ability to bring on peat. But like I said, peatlands have existed for millennia. So the ones in the Congo that were discovered, they've got nearly, I don't know, 10 meters of peat that they've existed for a very long time. They have been able to grow and grow and grow. Not as limited topography wise potentially, and then our impact has been lessened until recently. Now that we know that there's going to be some impacts, but lots of factors at play in terms of what controls peatland growth. A lot of it to do with climatic changes, but then also our influence on them as well.
Not really nutrients.
No, yeah, it's a kind of a complicated combination of nutrient status, climate, our influence. Yeah.
Great. I think that's all the questions we have time for. So thank you again, Scott. And if we could all give Scott another. So we've had a rather fantastic year for our public lecture series, and we will be continuing on in 2025. I'd like to give a quick shout out to Tom, my colleague, who has helped me prep and create these events. So we're really happy that we're able to kind of give you a block of talks rather than drip feed them to you as we have this year. So for those of you in person, we have little leaflets outside on the table with our QR code, so you can book tickets for these. And we also have a few others in the works. For those of you joining us online, thank you so much, and we hope to see you at the next public lecture. Thanks, everyone.